Oh boy! Hey, listen up! There's been a lot of sports writers and sports editors flapping their yaps about us getting soft. Ah, ha, ha, ha. Does this look soft to you, Paul? Does this look soft to you? Well, I'll tell you what. There's one part of our bodies that's soft, and it ain't soft all the time, if you catch my meaning.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 10 of the Pseudo Nerd Podcast for March 11th, 2016. I'm your podcast host, Josh Kiser, and welcoming back in studio is Josh Haddix.
Yep.
And, of course, just Kyle Hoagland.
You know what? That still hurts my feelings. You know, I didn't leave you last week, and yet you're still gonna treat me this way.
I just want to say sorry to all the fans out there that had to go a week without me and had to struggle through a podcast with Kiser and Hougie, because I listened to it myself, and I'll be honest, guys, it sucked. So,
well, that's the kind of feedback we need.
There was a lot of feedback just from my microphone, let alone the viewers who are listening.
Well, also, to be fair, it sucks every week, whether I'm here or not. So, we got that going for us, too.
Just degrees of suckiness based on who may or may not be here.
Yeah.
But you know what, gentlemen? We have now reached double digits for podcasts.
Who would have thought?
Cue the excitement.
Yeah. Who would have thought we'd be here?
I mean, 10 episodes, that's some sort of milestone, right?
It's one more than 9, so, I'll drink to that.
There you go. And in honor of 10 episodes, Hoagie, why don't you tell everybody the big news?
So, you know how every once in a while we like to think that we're an actual podcast that has some sort of credibility. Well, we've taken that step further, and we have launched pseudonerdpod.com, your one-stop shop for all things pseudo, all things pod, and also some shitty bio that Haddix put up there pretending that he's Spider-Man.
First off, entertaining bio is what you meant to say. So,
no, it's not what I. No.
Entertaining.
It is as entertaining as this podcast. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. But for people who aren't sure what I'm even talking about, pseudonerdpod.com, and you'll be able to listen to the latest podcast right at the top of the page. We'll have some blog posts. I mean, most of it's really just updates of what we're doing, but it does create the architecture for actually putting up blog posts. All of our social media, avenues that we talk about, all of those are available at a single click. You can also go there to subscribe on iTunes. And
which, speaking of, so I went to iTunes today, and every week I get on here and I tell you guys, hey, go subscribe to us on iTunes. That way it just downloads every Friday morning for you. It's very simple. And I say leave us a 5-star rating and some comments. You know, Hoagie, I went and looked at our reviews before today's podcast. There are 2 reviews, one from you and one from me. We can't even get fucking Haddix to review his own podcast.
He's too busy hanging out in Florida, hanging out with Dwayne Wade.
I thought you were going to say Dwayne Johnson. I was going to give you props for that, but fucking Dwayne Wade, dude, come on, man. Hey,
we were pretty much calling you LeBron James.
I'm not the guy that moved to another state and then all of a sudden became a Warriors fan and talks about how we handle our Browns situation. So
I like to also make a point that whenever I talk about the Browns here, people have to be reminded there's a team in Cleveland that plays football.
I mean, not like San Francisco's doing a whole lot right now.
Yeah.
Hey, they got Chip Kelly.
They do have Chip Kelly.
Where are we going with this? I feel like we're on something.
We're just talking about how Haddix was not reviewing us on iTunes, much like our listeners who need to leave us some feedback on there too. as well as Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all those things. Follow us, like us, comment, review, all that fun stuff. We appreciate it. Haddix, that goes for you as well.
Yeah, pretend not to be you and go ahead and get on there.
I mean, who reviews their own shit, dude? Come on.
It would have been a little bit easier for us if it wasn't the fact that our names on iTunes is like Kiser Sose and Hoagie 5822. We probably might have been able to mask that a little bit, but what are you gonna do?
What are you gonna do? You know what? It happens. All right, just like life happens, and you're Spider-Man. You just got to do it. But anyhow, this week's podcast, we're going to enter another monthly topic. We did Star Wars the first month, and I know March technically started last week, but with Haddix out, we thought we'd postpone that for another week and bring it in here with full strength. And this month's podcast is going to be all about wrestling, and not Olympic wrestling, but the sports entertainment kind. And with Wrestlemania coming up about a month's time or so, we thought it'd be a good time to do it.
I think they have one more. We even consider it a pay-per-view. It's
I
kind
would
of like
not,
a Saturday. I don't think anyone can actually pay for it from a cable company, so I guess really it's not a pay-per-view.
So, yeah, I mean, this is the big show's coming up. And he'll also be on that pay-per-view.
Oh, damn it, I was about to say.
So those are the jokes you guys are going to hear. So if you're not a fan of wrestling, I apologize. If you are a fan of wrestling, buckle up. It's about to be a wild ride. And for those of you who aren't a fan of wrestling, give us a shot here. We're going to try and, with this first podcast, sort of lay the foundation on the sport itself, sort of how it started, what we find interesting about it, why we ever liked it to begin with. I know it's not been for everybody in the past, and maybe if you listen, you'll kind of see it in a new light. So hopefully we're able to entertain you at least along the way.
I feel like at our age, and if the people who are listening to our podcasts are close to our age, I feel like it's a real. If you weren't a fan of wrestling then, I have a hard time believing that you were ever a wrestling fan, because that was the time to be into wrestling, and that was like really like the golden age of wrestling, which was probably in the mid to late 90s.
Right. I was going to say, you just said that you never specified the time until just then, but yes, that's the particular era you were referring to.
Absolutely.
But, well, let me ask you this, Kyle. When did you first? What got you into wrestling? I mean, what was it? When and what?
I think what got me into wrestling wasn't even wrestling. I saw the action figures. I saw like the wrestling buddies at like Toys R Us, and I'd heard of wrestlers, like the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan, but I feel like I really didn't start really getting into watching it until probably, what year was it that like the first King of the Ring came out? Like 91 maybe?
I was thinking 93, but maybe it was a little bit earlier than that.
So the first one, the first time I ever remembered watching something on TV about it, and I know back then like wrestling was really only on Saturday mornings, unless it was on like a Saturday main event or something like that on NBC. But you didn't have Monday Night Raw or anything like that. You didn't have prime time cable TV show that was dedicated to wrestling. So I would say I probably got into it and interested probably in the early 90s, and then stopped for a few years, like maybe like 95 to 98. And then from 98 basically on, I think I've been on and off pretty fanatic about pro wrestling.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in here before I bring Haddix into this conversation. And the reason for it is I started probably back around 91 or so. This was still sort of that era where Hulk Hogan was this like magical being, really. I mean, this character that was just unstoppable, and he was the American dream. Well, actually, that was Dusty Rhodes, but he was this persona that was larger than life. Most of the characters at the time were sort of very cartoonish, very exaggerated. Some of them are very silly and kind of stupid. But when you're 5, 6, 7 years old, they were fun. And at the time, I collected the action figures, the little toys. Me and Bobby, we had tons of them. We'd wrestle with those all the time, and that was I think the toys are what really drew me in back then. And then to your point, kind of fell out of it at some point, and it wasn't until that mid '90s when it blew up that I got back into it. Which I guess Haddix, is it safe to say that's when you first became a fan?
Oh yeah, I'm not sure exactly when it was, or the moment, or the pay-per-view and Hoagie's how he remembers the first King of the Ring. I'm not sure the exact moment that I came into it or got real hooked on it, but yeah, it was the Attitude Era, which we can explain in a little while. But that boom, that wrestling boom that Hoagie was talking about, where it was the gold. Well, I don't even know if that's what he was talking about with the golden era, but part of it anyway. That was when I got involved. That was when the storylines were amazing and things of that nature. So that was when I broke into the biz.
Okay, cool. So I guess we all had certain eras that we come in. The big era is the Attitude Era, and we're not going to focus too strongly on that this week. We're going to kind of save that podcast for next week. There's plenty to talk about with it, so I'd rather hold off till then. But there was definitely something entertaining about the sport. More, people are gonna say, "Oh, wrestling, it's fake. It's you guys know it's fake, right? It's not a real sport." Like, we know that, and it's not meant to be taken seriously. And I think that's what makes it fun at times, is they don't take themselves seriously. And I mean, that just goes into some of the personalities and the promos you see, but there's just a whole spectacle behind it.
I want to throw in a good analogy that Stone Cold uses on his podcast a lot when wrestling is fake is brought up. He always goes back to, if you go see Mission Impossible in the movie theater, Tom Cruise can't do all that stuff. Tom Cruise isn't going to go out there and kill all these guys, but it's still very entertaining. And for the time that you're watching it, or the times that you talk about the movie, you don't sit there and say, "Oh, well, Tom Cruise isn't really that guy. He can't really do that stuff." That, but you still enjoy it for what it is.
Yeah, you appreciate them for what they're doing out there.
For their talents, for their
and whether and there's multiple talents depending on what's going on. Like, some people are more talented with the in-ring skills. And it's like, oh, well, they're not really throwing punches. Well, no, they're not. But there's definitely an athleticism behind it based on different in-ring. It's almost acrobatic at times. And
the only difference too is that the difference between Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible and professional wrestlers is Tom Cruise can do this into his 50s and 60s, whereas a guy like Stone Cold Steve Austin had to retire at a relatively younger age because he had a broken neck and 2 banged up knees from doing a fake sport. So that's why I've always told people when they say it's fake, I'm like, you go talk to those guys who have died at age 40 because of brain injuries and heart attacks and just destroying their bodies and having to use painkillers and, being addicted to it. I mean, Scott Hall is a great example of a wrestler who, his life is screwed. His life was screwed up for a long time because of wrestling. And I'm sorry, but Tom Cruise doesn't have that type of,
I don't think he was making an exact comparison. I think he was drawing a comparison between the fact that it's not, wrestling is not real in the sense of a movie's not real, but you can still appreciate it for what it is, and the fact that the person doing it, is doing a good job at it and has to be talented to do it. Not anyone can just go be a wrestler. Same with not anyone can go act in a movie like Tom Cruise. So there's some skill and talent involved, but at the end of the day, it is slightly fake or fake, or whatever
right.
you want to say.
And actually, tying in both movies and wrestling, the movie The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke is really a phenomenal look at just the behind the scenes of the wrestling back in those days. And to your point, Kyle, fighting the addiction, fighting the pain and all the stuff that goes through it. So yeah, it's fake, but at the same time, a lot of the bumps are real. The injuries are real. I mean, there's plenty involved in the sport. It's just like anything else that could be scripted. You could still get hurt. And in this, they're doing this day in and day out. Most people don't realize this, but I mean, they're on the road almost the whole year round. Travel schedules are brutal. I mean, they're wrestling probably 4 or 5 nights a week. It takes a toll on your body.
I always like to compare it to like if you go to the circus or something like that, and like a lot of those acts are, they're people that clearly are putting their lives on the line. You have people who are being shot out of cannonballs and trapeze artists and things like that, and you're not going to judge the authenticity of their craft just because on top of that, they're going to do some fake punches. But whenever somebody like jumps and 30 feet in the air and lands on a canvas, which is I'll say I've been on a wrestling canvas before. It's not a trampoline. It's very stiff. It hurts. It's not something that like you're jumping on your bed. And so I sound like I get real like defensive about this, but I feel like people who have that argument about wrestling's fake or like I can't get into it because it's not real. I feel like those people have never actually really looked at wrestling with an open mind.
Right, I agree, and it's so. Let me ask you guys this, Haddix. How about you? What makes it entertaining for you? What brings a smile on your face, and what do you enjoy about wrestling?
I mean, at the end of the day, it is entertaining to watch. To me, when I watched it religiously, which I don't watch it as religiously now as I did years ago, it was the stories that were involved were, some people always say it's like a soap opera, an adult soap opera or whatever. Well, I guess soap operas are adult, but and that aspect of it was cool. But then at the same time, I mean, if they did a good enough job selling their feuds, they would go out there and it would look like they were having a fight. I mean, yeah, in the back of your mind, that it's all scripted, that they're telling each other what they're going to do, but it felt real. They're playing on your emotions. They really make you hate a certain person and love another person if they're doing their job correctly.
Oh yeah, when they're doing it right, I mean, you can really feed off of that. And even in the matches themselves, yeah, sure, person A is going to win the match over person B. 90% of the time, you don't necessarily know that outcome when you're watching it. You might have an assumption this person's going to win, the other person's not going to win. But if they play it right and they hit moves and the crowd's into it and it's just there's a whole show behind it. I mean, it's like watching a live performance, and it can really just engulf you and get you involved and get you like excited for the action that's taking place in the ring when it's done right and you got two people or more that really know their craft.
Yeah, exactly.
How about you, Hoagie? What entertains you most about what is it that draws you in?
It's kind of similar to what Haddix was talking about with the stories, and because to me, like the actual wrestling part, it's impressive, it's fun to watch, but I feel like what makes you want to watch every day or every week, in this case every Monday, is you want to see the progression of the story. And I think the one thing that a lot of that's kind of lacking with today's content is the emotional draw. I felt like 10 years ago, or even I can probably even go back just 5 years ago, you actually get emotionally invested in your favorite wrestlers. Like you have your favorite guys that you cheer for, and not just because they're good, but they have the ability to make you feel what they're feeling. And it's it sounds ridiculous for somebody who's probably never watched wrestling to see, like, why would you get emotionally invested in somebody who's clearly it's just an act? I'm like, okay, well, you're over there watching Game of Thrones and you're being emotionally invested in people that you know for a fact none of those people, are immune to getting the axe at any point. So what's the difference? What's the difference between having that strong feeling for, in this case, an actor versus an actor who just happens to be a wrestler?
Exactly. It goes back to what Haddix was saying about it being like a movie or something. I mean, you are watching a story unfold between two or more people, and it's a week in and week out. It's a show. It's we'll kind of get into it more as we go further, but it's at the point where every Monday they've ran over 1,200 episodes of this show without repeating, without taking breaks. They might have a random week off or something like that, but they'll have a taped episode and it'll play on Monday. There's a new episode for the last 13 plus, or not 13, I'm sorry, like 20 some odd years at this point, 29 years maybe. Did it debut in about 93? So I mean, for it to do that week in and week out, they have new stories, characters. Like, yeah, you're going to get invested in a particular storyline. You're going to cheer for certain characters. You're going to hate other characters, and it's just it's just the same as watching some other television show where you like certain characters, you hate other certain characters, and it's just the only difference is this gets played out in a wrestling ring as opposed to somewhere, some fantasy land or some whatever setting.
And there's something about live television that I think puts even more of that emotion into it, because when you're watching something that's already taped, sure, because that everything is choreographed exactly the way it is, but because it's live TV, anything can happen, and that right there is automatically gripping television. It's interesting because you're watching it at the same time they're doing it. Like Monday Night Raw is live,
and a lot of it,
99.9% of the time.
And it's improv a lot. I mean, they have certain scripts that they're supposed to sort of loosely follow, but there's no rehearsal. It's more scripted, sure, but even still, there's a certain improvisation that has to take place, and they're basically doing it on the fly. The people that have memorized what a writer's written for them, it comes off that way, and they're we'll get into that probably more next week. There's certain characters that just you can see through them. That they're bad actors, if you want to call them that, or they're too scripted, too rigid. And then the ones that are good, the ones that are natural, I mean, they're just it's a sight to see. Just like you watch a good actor as opposed to a bad actor in a television or movie. So let's dive into kind of the history a little bit. We've sort of talked about how the product has changed and evolved and over time, and really wrestling has been around for a long time, and up until probably the mid 80s, it was a lot of territories, which basically it wasn't televised, or if it was a local televised product, and each region may cover a couple of states, might cover a state or two, and they all certain wrestlers wrestled at those territories, and then that was it. They had a certain circuit they traveled, and they maybe had shows every couple of weeks or every week in that location, but it was very localized. You didn't have, Hulk Hogan was around, but he wasn't this, nationwide known person at the time.
He was wrestling up in, kind of like in the Connecticut area, kind of like northeast-ish. I think that's where, Vince McMahon's father's territory was.
New York was like the headquarters for it. But yeah, they each had their own regions. And it really wasn't until Vince McMahon, well, he's the, junior, but most people know who Vince McMahon is these days. He kind of had this broader, vision that he was going to go, nationwide, global, that whole thing. And that's sort of where the creation of the WWF came, and kind of evolved into that what I was talking about, what first got me into wrestling, that late 80s, early 90s show where it was, we're not thinking just region now. We're thinking it would be like the NFL, you having a football team and there might be 3 teams in Ohio, 2 in Pennsylvania, and 1 in Indiana or something, and they all play each other and there's like a champion there, and that is what it is. And then somebody NFL said one day, like, well, why don't we just go through all the states? And that's sort of what he did. And at the time it was sort of, it was seen as a little crazy, and a lot of the other territories probably weren't happy with it because they all had sort of their own gigs going. And, it's turned into a giant empire now.
It's like a circus meets like drug cartel. Like everybody, it's an entertaining service or a product that everybody has their territories, and you kind of stay out of the territories. At that time, you had like 8 world champions that in the United States. You had like Tennessee, you had North Carolina, you had New York, you had Texas, and all of them had their own franchise world champion. But you didn't travel. The guys over in New York weren't going to Texas to wrestle. The guys in Texas weren't going to North Carolina. It was kind of an understood almost monopoly that just said, this is our area. That's where, this is where we service. And like you said, Vince was, kind of like the visionary that felt like that's ridiculous. If we really want to make this go the next step, then why aren't we going to Texas? Why aren't we going to North Carolina? Like it's not fair to the fans who, as great as like a guy like Ric Flair is, but why can't guys down in North Carolina see Hulk Hogan?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it paid off, obviously, to where we're at this point. But one of the biggest things, another big thing Vince did is back in the days of territories, and even, probably from the dawn of wrestling up until the mid-'80s or so, people say, oh, it's fake, it's fake. Back then, it wasn't thought to be fake. I mean, people thought that was real. The villains, or heels, as they're like to be known in the profession, were hated. They had, people would throw stuff at them. Some got stabbed. I mean, it was, if you were a truly bad person in the stories, you didn't let people know that it was a story. Just, they did not get along with the good guys. They didn't travel with them. They were not seen outside of the work with them. You basically kept in character no matter where you're at, what you were doing. It was really like method acting to an extreme level. And it's what they call keeping kayfabe. It's a wrestling term. And it was something that was just always done for years. And it wasn't till the mid-'90s or so that Vince came out and basically shattered it and told, there was some people thought it was fake and had their reservations. He basically came out and admitted, like, yeah, this isn't wrestling, this is sports entertainment, and changed the whole landscape. And it was kind of a ballsy thing to do.
Well, I feel like he's saying something that I'm sure. I mean, I saw it when I first heard that, and I'm 10 years old, so there's still probably a small part of me that wanted to think that it's real. I understand that like a big, huge man shouldn't be able to punch a guy 5 times in the face and nothing really happens. That's not exactly realistic. But it was almost kind of like being told like Santa doesn't exist. Like when like at that level, when you're like 8 or 9 years old, or whenever, however old we were when Vince came out and said that in '94, like that is a ballsy thing to do, because even still to that point, I think everybody can kind of agree that your clientele, your biggest fans are not adults. They're children. Like children, I think even then, I feel like the 8 to 12-year-old demographic was a big part of your business.
Yeah, I mean, it was children and hillbillies at that point.
Or hillbilly children.
Those two. So that was, he pretty much, destroyed kayfabe and, basically embraced this, hey, we're putting on a weekly soap opera, more or less. And that was sort of the dawn of the Attitude Era, which, again, we'll talk more about next week. but we'd be remiss not to say it in the history of how things evolved, because at this point, WCW was sort of the other big franchise at the time, and Ted Turner owned them, and Ted Turner pretty much owned everything in the television circuit and gave prime time to WCW. Well, meanwhile, WWF, owned by Vince, had prime time on the USA Network, and the two battled every Monday night, showing these live shows for hours on end, and pulled some ridiculous viewership. And to your point, Haddix, that's probably about the time that drew you into the sport.
Well, I mean, it was fueled by that competitiveness. You had to be better than your counterpart. So you were trying to come up with cool stuff. You were both franchises were both trying to outdo the other one. So it made for great television.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things they did, because Kyle was talking about, is how it was, for years, wrestling was big for children. I mean, that was, like I said, they had these larger-than-life cartoon characters. And when they started having this, when it hit this Attitude Era, and it hit this Monday Night Wars with WCW and WWF, they took a whole new approach and made it more realistic. I say they just killed that. They just told everyone that this is fake, but they took a more realistic approach to the characters themselves. Instead of having a giant clown out there wrestling, you instead have this guy. They call him by his first and last name, and he's out there, acting and doing things like just a normal person, and not some cartoonish over the top character. And it added a aspect of realism to it. Is that fair to say,
yeah.
Kyle?
Yeah, and it gave it where I think one of the things I remember Vince saying in that little that video clip of him talking about how it's not real is that the wrestling for a long time has been kind of insulting people's intelligence with the fact of, like, obviously these wrestlers are not, they're not garbage men, they're not dentists, they're not deranged dentists, they're not clowns. These are actors. So why are we continuing with this old notion of these comic book characters, the say your prayers and take your vitamins type of people, when what you want is something more raw? That's what to put that play on words, but something that it's going to make more sense to more people, because I think for the most part people know that when the show is over, Doink the Clown goes into the backstage and wipes off all of his makeup and puts on a leather jacket. And
what? Doink the Clown wasn't real?
Kyle, you are just spoiling stuff all over the place.
We're gonna have to re-record this podcast and put spoiler alerts at the beginning now. Thanks a lot, Hoagie.
Hey, Isaac Yankem was not a dentist.
It was. I feel like the Attitude Era, without delving too deep into it, was like an R-rated TV show. And it made for and not R-rated in nudity, because there obviously wasn't. I mean, there was scantily clad women from time to time, but just the darkness of some of the storylines, the attitudes of people, no pun intended. And that's what made for good TV, and that's what people like. They like.
Yeah, I mean, it was. They had Jerry Springer on there for a reason. They brought that level of violence and cursing and sex and all those things in. And for us at the time, who were like these teenage boys, it's like everything you could ask for. Yeah, exactly.
It's fun. I feel like that type of show hits the demographic of kids that were our age, plus adults tune it. Maybe not as religiously, but I mean it's intense enough for adults to enjoy, instead of in the 90s where it was kind of cheesy. Not that adults didn't like it then either, but they knew more. They could enjoy it more. Fake.
Right,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
could appreciate it more. Before it's like, oh, this is cool, I'll take my kid to it, they'll enjoy it. Now it's,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I can take my kid to it, but I kind of want my kid to be a little bit older, and I'm going to enjoy it because these guys are bloody, they're lighting things on fire, these girls are wrestling in their underwear, they're telling each other to suck it, they're calling each other assholes. I mean, they're doing everything they can to push the boundaries, really, of what was considered cable television at the time. And honestly, it in many ways would push cable television if it was played like it was then today even. So I mean, it was not that watered down children's show. It became a much more adult oriented, or at least adolescent to adult oriented television show with all those stories that really could appeal to a vast majority of audiences.
And then when you were done watching Raw, does anyone remember, like, after Raw was over, like, the shows that were right after it were like La Femme Nikita and Silk Stockings?
I remember Silk Stockings back in the day, because when I used to watch Raw, like when I watched Raw back in the early 90s, like when it was still the cartoonish characters, when they were just like starting to find their way, but it was still kind of that way. I remember every once in a while I'd be allowed to stay up late because it was a school night, and Raw started at like 9 o'clock. And I always remember that opening scene of Silk Stockings, like their opening intro, and it's like this girl putting on pantyhose. And as a little boy, I was like, man, that's pretty hot right there.
I mean, you could have picked that up and dropped that beginning part of Silk Stockings like in a Cinemax softcore porn, and you could have gotten away with it. Like, I don't think I ever watched any episode of Silk Stockings, but it always just seemed like, I'm too young to watch this.
Yeah, you just felt
but
like
it fit right
you
into
were
it,
getting
like, right
away
after
with
Raw.
something. Oh, absolutely. So the product from the Attitude Era moves into, it eventually loses viewership, it dies down, and at the end of the day, they are a business. They went, everybody kind of folded. WWF became WWE, and they took over everything. They bought everything out. They became the sole competition, and in doing so, probably killed themselves a little bit, but they had to turn to, they rely on sponsors. They became a nationally traded stock. They joined the stock market. That's what I was trying to say. And in doing so, you have certain regulations you have to follow, certain standards and practices, and just a certain way you have to go about your business. So they really had to tone things down, and they started toning down the sex, toning down the blood, toning down the violence. And it's almost, they kept it realistic. That's sort of where we're at these days, where you're not playing those cartoonish characters, but it's definitely geared more towards kids, young adults. There's not as much cursing. There's all that. So it's a much different product these days, and you almost have to appreciate more the wrestling side of it than so much the violence and the stories have to be told differently, I guess.
Well, I think the big difference between now and then is now, like you said, the content of the actual matches is really good in comparison to like the late 90s. I think I've remembered better quality matches now, or at least in the past 5-6 years, than back then. But what was more gripping, it's one of those things where like I don't think I could really recall, other than like the iconic matches, but I couldn't really go back and really say like, oh man, that was a great match, because that's not what we were like holding on to when we were younger. Like it was all about the content of the storyline, and to your point, when you buy your competition, nobody's on it. Nobody is, scared to lose their job. No one's scared that their company is going to, keel over. So you're not everybody's not pushing themselves to 110% every night because they don't need to. Like they're already in the only ticket in town, and you already made it. So now what's being focused on nowadays is not I guess they're focused on the brand. They're focused on like things like the WWE Network. They're focused on, like you said, the what investors are saying. That becomes more important because now they actually have the ability to focus on. They had no time to focus on things like that when they thought that any month could have been the month where they're not there anymore.
Yeah, there's definitely. Go ahead, Haddix.
I'll say I agree. I mean, I don't want to get too much into it because I think we might touch more on that next week. But yeah, I agree with that. When you lose the competitiveness, you kind of lose the edginess. So
yeah,
and the Christianius.
Nice. And that the same could be said for any business. I mean, you lose that competition, you lose the desire, the urge to drive yourself. I mean, there's a reason capitalism works, and there's a reason competition is a good thing in all aspects of business and life. So that's sort of a quick rundown of where wrestling started to where it is today. Very, very basic outline. We could talk for hours on any particular of those topics. And next week, we're going to dive more into the Attitude Era as well as the current product, sort of do a little compare and contrast, that kind of thing, which is why we're not going to get into it too much today. But let me ask you this. What are your, what are some favorite memories, Haddix, or favorite things or anything around wrestling, whether it was a pay-per-view or anything you did or a game, all that?
I mean, I won't get too in-depth with, like, particular matches because, I mean, there's some great ones out there that any wrestling fan, could tell you or could rattle off. But as I'm sure you guys know, The Rock is, like, my favorite thing to come out of, I guess, WWE or whatever, or that Attitude Era or whatever. I mean, I loved a lot of wrestlers back then and still do to this day, but The Rock was just, I mean, to borrow a word from him, the man was electrifying,
There's two things I know about you. You're not a fan of Cam Newton, and you love yourself some
I want to go on record and say that I am a fan of Dwayne The Rock Johnson. I mean, the guy, like, you'd be watching an episode of Raw or SmackDown, and if his music hit, I mean, you were in front of the TV. Like, those are the moments you waited. And some other wrestlers were like that too. But you did not see a segment with The Rock. Like, and if you missed it, you were pissed because something good happened, whether he made you laugh, whether it was a good match, any of those types of things. I mean, the Rock was my favorite moment from my hardcore days of wrestling.
Hoagie, what about you?
I feel like my favorite thing about wrestling was growing up with it, when you're 12, 13, 14 years old, was not wrestling. It was, I feel like all of us as friends growing up, I mean, we did a lot of really fun stuff together with wrestling. We used to go to our friend's house and, do the pay-per-views, and it was a really social thing to do. Like, we would go to the high school and, like, have wrestling matches on, like, the high jump mat. We used to have ladder matches on the side of my house where we would, like, fight for Girl Scout cookies, and that's a fucking true story. I almost broke a rib because our friend Matt frog splashed me from the top of my parents' minivan. Like, that's how into it we were. Like, we used to beat the crap out of each other with cookie sheets. Kiser, you still have that cookie sheet that has, like, my
I do. I actually cook pizzas on that still.
You should take a picture of it. We'll put it up on the old Instagrammers.
I could do that, absolutely.
But I mean, that's, to me, like, I love wrestling, but I think the more fun thing about it was just the social aspect of it, and, like, I made a lot of really good friends, like, that around wrestling, because it was, like, the one thing that during that time, like I said, you either were not into it at all, or you were fanatically into it. And so it really, like, created a lot of good friendships from it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there were so many things that I love. When I got big into wrestling again back in '98 or so, I remember we actually had to do that was when the hardcore wrestling was big, which is, to your point, the use of weapons and different foreign objects. It wasn't just the athletics of a wrestling match, but there was, they were breaking through tables and they were hitting each other with chairs, and at some points they were getting real, crazy, just whatever pretty much you could find. There was matches in, the backstage, in boiler rooms, in, supermarkets and all that. And we had a project for Spanish class, and we had to present something about Spanish, and we just chose Lucha Libre, which is just the Spanish version of wrestling, and basically had a hardcore wrestling match on the long jump mats, or the pole vault mats at the high school.
I think it was the high jump mat.
Oh, okay, high jump. I don't know, pole vault, high jump, whatever it is. And we just wrestled out there on that. And because I was the smallest guy, it was pretty much people just doing different finishers to me and throwing me through everything and hitting me with whatever they could hit me with. And just doing that and filming it. And I did the same thing at trampolines in the backyard, filming it and doing, whole elaborate shows where, I'd write. We legitimately had a trampoline federation when we were like 13 years old. Yeah, I had theme musics. We had, for pay-per-views, quote unquote, we actually had pyros and, smoke bombs and things like that. And we had all kinds of crazy matches, and I wrote like all the storylines for it. So, I mean, it was very fun, entertaining way to grow up and burn some time. And it really kept us in school because I think it really brought out our writing skills. Jokingly, I say that, but at the same time, we also did e-feds. That was a huge thing back then, and a lot of that had to do with you being able to create a good story, and a lot of that involved your ability to write. And a lot of these people who are doing this were probably adults, and then you had a bunch of 12, 13-year-olds that were in there like us who were rivaling these guys because we were so into it that we really wanted to write our own storylines with our characters. It's sad to think about it now, how much time was spent doing that, but regardless, it was a ton of fun to do, and it kept us from doing heroin. But it did not keep the wrestlers from doing heroin. Oh no, the heroin kept the concussions away. And actually, so there's definitely a dark side to wrestling, and a lot of wrestlers, they battle addictions and things like that. But if you ever want to get entertained, one of the things we kind of brushed over was there's a lot of promos in wrestling where they sit out there and they basically look at the camera and talk shit about another wrestler they're going to fight. Some of the most entertaining things in the world are sitting down and watching, especially the late 80s, 90s promos, and more than anyone else, the Macho Man Randy Savage, when he's coked out of his mind, those are some of the most absurd, over the top, entertaining promos you can ever watch. It's incoherent. I just recently listened to one just because you just want to have a good laugh. You're having a bad day, just go to YouTube and just type Macho Man Randy Savage promo, and you'll just smile. It's like a free kitten video. Haddix, anything you want to add about any promos or the Macho Man or kitten videos?
Not necessarily about Macho Man, because again, that was kind of before my time. I have seen some, looking back. But you want to see some good promos, you look up some Ric Flair promos and watch that dude strut around. Those are some good promos.
See, I like how you say I don't remember too much of that old stuff, but Ric Flair.
Well, Ric Flair. The promos I talk about with Ric Flair though are his WCW days. During that Attitude, again, when they were pushing the envelope of TV and had these really good storylines going on, and Ric Flair is taking his pants off and strutting around the ring.
Yeah, Ric Flair went from being the style and profiling, the cool guy, the guy that every guy wants to be and every woman wants to be with, type of guy with that kind of confidence and whatever. And then in the late 90s, he just loses his fucking mind.
Yeah, he's just a nut, and it's just hilarious. So
fucking elbow dropping nobody.
Yeah.
And that's one of the as we sort of wind things down here, one of the nice things about wrestling is it doesn't take itself seriously, and they can do stupid shit that sometimes you would watch, and in any other context you'd be like, this is absolutely ridiculous, this is absurd, like, what am I doing? But with wrestling, you're like, you know what? It's stupid, it makes no sense, but it's okay, because it's wrestling. And it's hard to explain it to somebody who's never sat down and watched it, but you might, if you're just a first-time viewer and you're flipping through and you sit and you look at something, you're like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Yeah, it probably doesn't, and it probably seems stupid. But if you're a fan of wrestling, you almost have an appreciation for some of that stupid silliness.
And there is a video that I know all three of us have watched. It's called Wrestling Isn't Wrestling. It's a really nice video, even for people who maybe have never, ever really given wrestling a chance. And he does a really good job of kind of explaining just one character's progression, because he talks about a certain wrestler and his like 10 years of creating his story and creating his legacy from like basically from 97 to now, so we're talking 25 years or 20 years or whatever it is, and it's a really cool thing to watch. It features a bunch of really hot chicks playing wrestlers. So, I mean, right there, even if you're not really that interested in that and you're into hot chicks, that's also a good reason to watch it. But yeah, it's Wrestling Isn't Wrestling. I'll put it on Twitter when this comes up.
You could also put it on the website as well.
On your blog, on the website. There you go. Yeah.
On another topic, if you want to see kind of another parody of like, wrestling, there's a great movie called Backdoor to China.
It's a good documentary. Well, it really is.
It's a good one. It's something.
I think it won a Tony or a Danza. It's right after the Tonys.
Oh, there you go. All right. Well, so one more thing. How about each of you tell me one more thing that we haven't talked about that you wanted to make a point about when it comes to anything wrestling wise that we're not going to discuss going forward, or not really going to get into much going forward. Hougie, I'll let you start.
Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I only say because Skype is telling me hold on while we try to get the call back. So okay, I'm still here for now. Can you please repeat the question? Sorry, I was freaking out.
I said just one more thing that you maybe want to talk about that we haven't got a chance to discuss that we probably won't talk about in the future podcasts about wrestling, if there's anything.
Well, I will say this about wrestling too. If you fancy yourself a gamer, I really don't think that there are very few things I think are more fun than a wrestling video game. And I'm not even talking about the new stuff. And I feel like some of the new stuff is still good, but I'm talking about like the old Nintendo 64.
The N64 games were probably some of the best wrestling games ever. I literally hung out with one guy because he had a Nintendo 64 and the wrestling games, and it was like I didn't have a Nintendo 64, so that's where I was going to go hang out.
I mean, one of the last times I even came over and hung out with you, we were playing Wrestlemania 2000, or what were we playing?
Or it might have been that or No Mercy.
Or no, I think it was No Mercy, which is my favorite of all of them, easily.
Yeah, oh yeah, the wrestling games are definitely a good time. Creating your own wrestlers, just playing around. I mean, it's a fun gig.
This guy over here created Pokemon Master. That was your boy.
You know it. Haddix, how about you? Anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I think I'm good. I think I could save anything else till next week. We got a month of this, so no need to try to throw it all in.
Yeah, that's true. Well, one thing I wanted to just sort of kind of reiterate and discuss one more, kind of put into words to answer the initial question, why do we love wrestling? And for me, there's something to be said. You sit here week in and week out, and you watch two people, and if they're good at their craft, and they make you hate the one guy, and maybe he's the villain that week in and week out he keeps causing mayhem to the face, to the baby face, which is the good guy. He's maybe making him lose matches, maybe, cheating and lying, that kind of thing, to get his, his point across, to get him to make himself look better, to become, to stay champion, let's say. And then there's finally a payoff, and whether it's at that next pay-per-view or maybe this feud goes on for a couple of months at a time, when it's done right, and you finally see that villain, lose, and that babyface gets that 3 count, and the crowd is into it, and there's just this whole back and forth, and then the match, it finally ends. There's something about it that just really, you can get excited, and you got a good crowd behind it, and you got 2 people that can really work a match. I mean, there's just an excitement that you can really enjoy about it. And if people who are very curious, like, hey, I wanna check it out. It's something, you have any recommendations? I'll be more than happy to tell you guys, a couple of matches here or there that are really worth. If you watch those and it doesn't do anything for you, then maybe wrestling's not for you. But I think it's definitely there. There's an excitement there for everybody.
The matches that are really worth watching are the ones that you can, like we have already said a couple of times, you can actually invest in it emotionally. And there are plenty of matches that I can even think of that you could never have seen a wrestling match. But if I told you if you just looked at the promo, and then maybe it got a little bit of a background story of what the match is all about, and then actually watch the match, you're not worried about, if the last thing you're really focusing on is how good the match is as far as just execution of, wrestling moves, but you're actually focusing it more on just feeling what's actually happening in the ring. That's a really important thing. And I once again, I don't mean to keep going back to that wrestling isn't wrestling video. But what you just said, one of the things he said was like, when it's good, it's good. When it's bad, it's really bad. But when it's great, it's awesome. Like there's not much really that compares to a great match that is surrounded by great storyline and 2 guys that are selling it to thousands and thousands of people that are just they're hook, line, and sinker. They've bought into it. And they're going crazy, or they're stunned and silent. It's like everybody is just, in it emotionally.
I agree, and I think that's a good place to end things here. I think it's well stated. So next week, we're going to go ahead and get a little more detailed. And we talked about that Attitude Era and the current product. That's what we're going to get more into. So we'll talk about that all next week. So, from the home of Jerry the King Lawler to the home of Rikishi, I am Josh Kiser. He is Josh Haddix. And he is Kyle Hoagland. We'll see you guys next week.
Have a good Friday.
See you later.